I never raised my voice to get attention. I didn't command meetings with charisma or dominate conversations with clever turns of phrase. That was never how I led. I led through precision, through listening so carefully that what I said didn't need to be loud. It needed to be right. And for the better part of 8 years, that was enough. I managed logistics, people, vendors, contracts, and crises with equal calm. When I spoke, it was to ask the one question no one else had thought of. And the answers to those questions saved us time, saved us money, and more than once, saved a client. But all of that shifted the day our founder stepped down and handed the reins to his son. Noah came in with a vision. He talked about breaking old cycles and turning up the energy. In his first company-wide address, he used the phrase, "move fast," 6 times in 15 minutes. I listened quietly from the back of the room. It wasn't what he said that concerned me, it was what he didn't. There was no mention of the systems we'd spent years refining, no nod to the client relationships we'd fought to preserve during industry shakeups, no acknowledgement of the people who had quietly kept the machine running. Within weeks, there were shifts, not publicly announced, just subtle. I was removed from cross-functional planning meetings I had once led. 2 loud, fast-talking department heads, neither of whom had ever delivered a campaign on time, were suddenly promoted to strategic advisors to the CEO. When I asked whether the restructuring would affect operational workflows, Noah smiled and said, "We're leaning into dynamic leadership styles now. You'll be better suited staying close to the ground." Close to the ground. That's how he framed the work that kept the company from collapsing under its own ambition. But I didn't argue. I nodded, and then I did what I had always done. I observed. And the more I observed, the more I understood. I wasn't being repositioned. I was being erased. One by one, the teams I had built were rerouted. Hiring decisions happened without my input. Tools I had implemented were replaced with flashier software that looked sleek but couldn't handle complexity. My insight, once valued as a compass, was now treated like background noise. But the moment that made it unignorable came in a one-on-one with Noah. I had flagged a vendor reliability issue that could delay a major client delivery. He cut me off mid-sentence, leaned back, and said, "Isabelle, you're brilliant, but too quiet for leadership. People need to feel energy to follow someone. You don't bring presence, you bring precision. It's not the same." I said nothing, not because I had no words, but because I had too many. And none of them would have changed what he had already decided. After that meeting, I knew something had shifted, not just in how I was seen, but in how I saw them. When someone tells you that your quiet is a weakness, they're not just rejecting your tone, they're rejecting your approach, your way of understanding, your method of leading. Noah hadn't critiqued a presentation, he had dismissed a philosophy. From that moment on, I started stepping back, not out of resentment, but recognition. The space I had once filled so naturally was being overwritten, not challenged. Meetings I used to lead were now conducted without my input. My name vanished from shared decks. Initiatives I had built were rebranded as new directives, handed off to managers who thrived on sound bites and urgency. I wasn't being asked to contribute less. I was being prepared to disappear. The operations team, once stable and quietly effective, began to fracture under the weight of inexperience. Deadlines were missed, vendors confused, minor breakdowns left unaddressed until they ballooned. But Noah didn't see the cracks. He saw energy. He praised those who kept the momentum going, even when that momentum was leading us in the wrong direction. I remember sitting in a quarterly leadership review, listening to a manager give a chaotic summary of a client delivery that had gone sideways. He used phrases like rapid decision-making and adaptive outcomes. I waited for someone, anyone, to ask what those words actually meant. No one did. They applauded him, and in that applause, I saw what kind of leadership they wanted. Volume over clarity, charisma over competence. I stopped pushing for visibility. Instead, I began tracking. I documented what I had been removed from: meetings, workflows, long-term planning. I saved versions of operating procedures before they were overwritten. I logged the differences, not for revenge, not even for defense, but because I needed to know exactly how an organization forgets who it depends on. Around me, the culture hardened. People who once asked thoughtful questions now performed certainty. Disagreement became career suicide. There was no room for pause, no space for analysis. Everything had to move fast, but fast doesn't mean forward. And I had spent too long inside systems to mistake motion for progress. When a procurement error triggered a contract breach, I offered a quiet suggestion on how it could have been avoided. It was ignored. When a client complained that onboarding felt rushed and impersonal, I offered to audit the process. Noah replied, "That's not your lane anymore." I understood. The company had chosen its direction, and it didn't include me, so I stopped trying to steer the wheel. I started watching instead. And what I saw was a culture accelerating toward collapse. Unaware that it was burning fuel without checking the engine, I stayed. Not because I thought I could save it, but because I knew exactly how it would fall apart. And I wanted to see, with clarity and silence, what happened when a system stopped listening. I didn't push back. I didn't try to win back my seat at the table. I had seen enough to know that when power changes hands in a system that values volume over substance, logic becomes invisible. The louder voices weren't interested in stability, they were interested in motion. It didn't matter where they were going, only that it looked like movement. So I stopped offering direction. I gave them what they thought they wanted, silence. But that silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. In the space they gave me by removing responsibility, I began documenting what they couldn't see. I tracked breakdowns in supply chain communication, delays in vendor compliance, increases in operating costs that had no process-based justification. I kept notes on missed contract reviews, late-stage project revisions, client feedback left unanswered for days. None of it was sabotage. All of it was observable. I wasn't forecasting failure. I was recording its architecture. And I did it quietly, the same way I had once held the company together. While they focused on rebranding and restructuring, I focused on what no one wanted to look at, the operational core. It was eroding, slowly and invisibly, because they had mistaken stability for stagnation. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming I had no options, but I had always been strategic about my relationships. Over the years, I had built a quiet network, clients who trusted my word, vendors who relied on my fairness, former colleagues who had watched my leadership in motion even when others dismissed it. I didn't announce anything. I didn't position myself for departure, but I began reaching out, softly and informally, not to ask for opportunities, just to reconnect, to listen, to take the temperature, and what I heard confirmed what I had suspected. People outside the company had noticed the shift. Deadlines were slipping. The tone in meetings had changed. Some weren't sure who to speak to anymore. Others said they were watching closely. That phrase repeated itself often enough that I started writing it down. Watching closely. It wasn't a warning, it was a signal. That trust had started to erode not just inside the walls, but beyond them. And I knew what that meant. Systems don't collapse from noise. They collapse from unnoticed silence. I had been dismissed as too quiet for leadership, but the silence they assigned to me was becoming the one thing they couldn't control. The more they sidelined me, the more clearly I saw how disconnected leadership had become from the truth of the organization. Strategy meetings were now theater, well-rehearsed narratives, energy-charged jargon, and forecasts drawn from selective optimism. But I no longer flinched at being excluded. I welcomed the distance. It gave me room to watch without interference. And in that space, I began building something of my own. Not a business, not yet, but a framework, a system for how I would lead if I ever had the chance. I started with the gaps, the overlooked warning signs, the ignored feedback loops, the mismatched incentives. I studied how arrogance replicates itself in culture, how it rewards speed and punishes stillness. And I mapped how those patterns had spread through our company like a virus, infecting process, trust, retention. I wasn't angry, I was analytical. While they focused on image, I tracked consequence. When an executive presented a record growth quarter, I noted that client churn had quietly doubled. When marketing bragged about campaign virality, I traced how our internal logistics team had scrambled to meet impossible timelines, cutting corners, exhausting staff, and silently absorbing the blow. I had seen it before, not here, but in the industry. The same cycle. Rapid expansion, ego-driven decisions, poor operational hygiene, then collapse. The difference this time was that I wasn't on the outside analyzing it. I was inside, moving through it with precision and a long memory. Quiet doesn't mean passive. It means deliberate, and I was more deliberate than I had ever been. Every day, I updated a private record. Missteps, mismatched outcomes, rising costs, failed client retention efforts. Not because I wanted to bring it all down, but because I knew no one else would preserve the truth. They were rewriting the company's history in real time, shaping a narrative where problems were blamed on market shifts and growing pains. But I had the data. I had timelines, I had names, and in the background, the calls kept coming. Vendors asking if I still had visibility, former clients asking if I had moved on yet, industry contacts suggesting coffees that weren't about catching up, they were about planning. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no, I just listened. Because what I was building wasn't a dramatic exit, it was an understanding of timing. And timing is everything, especially when the structure is wobbling and no one at the top realizes the foundation is already gone. It started the way structural failures always do, quietly, then all at once. The first sign came from a longtime vendor who stopped responding to requests. At first, leadership blamed it on miscommunication, then on scheduling. Then finally, they admitted the real reason: late payments, 3 months overdue. It wasn't the amount that shocked me. It was the fact that no one had noticed until the relationship was already damaged. That had once been my domain. Financial workflows, contract alerts, escalation flags. The systems I had built for those checks had been quietly dismantled in the name of efficiency. Now, the absence of those systems was making noise. Not dramatic noise, but operational friction. Delays, dropped details, mounting tension. Clients were still smiling in meetings, but internally, the tone had changed. We were losing reliability. A former client, one I had worked closely with, sent a notice of termination. The reason was vague: strategic misalignment. But I didn't need a full explanation. I had been on the first call that started that relationship. I knew what had once held it together, and I knew what had been removed when I was told to stay close to the ground. More clients followed, not all at once. Some just began scaling back their scope. Others sent feedback surveys that no one answered. One started working with a competitor on a pilot basis. And within our walls, anxiety started to ripple. Project managers began triple-checking deliverables. Team leads stayed later. Leadership doubled down on positive culture messaging, posting about resilience and adaptability while quietly increasing performance pressure. People were burning out, but smiling through it. It was the performance of stability, but I could see the seams. The team knew something was wrong, even if no one would say it out loud. Mistakes that would have once prompted reflection now prompted defensiveness. Questions were seen as disloyalty, and Noah, he leaned harder into energy. He called emergency all-hands meetings to reignite urgency. He blamed legacy systems for the delays, systems I had once designed. When one executive gently pushed back, he was cut out of future strategy sessions. The message was clear: align or step aside. But the problem wasn't in the alignment, it was in the direction. And the deeper the company leaned into momentum, the more it disconnected from reality. I didn't interfere, I didn't warn anyone, because this wasn't a storm that needed outside pressure to bring it down. It was already collapsing under the weight of its own denial. The unraveling took shape slowly, too slow for those chasing quarterly wins, but fast enough for anyone who understood systems. By the time they realized what was happening, the damage was already structural. A second key client submitted notice. No dramatic call, no heated exit interview, just a calm final message. We're going in a different direction. I knew the subtext. They had lost confidence. And in our industry, confidence isn't lost through one failure. It's lost through a pattern of unmet expectations, poor follow-through, and leadership that pretends optimism is a strategy. The aftermath wasn't immediate panic, it was spin. Meetings were filled with language like normal attrition, realignment opportunities, room for fresh energy. But the people closest to the work, the project leads, the vendor teams, the clients themselves, weren't fooled. They could feel the slippage. And slippage is contagious. Timelines became suggestions. Cross-team collaboration stalled. Managers began documenting more, not for improvement, but for protection. HR sent out a pulse survey to assess morale. The results were never shared. Internally, you could sense the shift. It wasn't just that people were worried, it was that they had stopped believing the people in charge could fix it. They smiled in meetings, nodded in sync, sent upbeat recap emails, but underneath, they were planning exits. Some had already left. Others, like me, stayed still, but alert. I watched Noah respond to the tension not with reflection, but with bravado. He doubled down on vision decks, talked about the next stage of transformation, and announced a new internal mantra: more forward, less fear. The irony was thick. There was no forward, and fear had already settled in. Only now it wore the shape of forced optimism and delayed accountability. I kept my documentation up to date. Every exit, every missed payment, every campaign that was quietly canceled before launch. I tracked the language in internal emails, how it shifted from clarity to abstraction. I noted how risk became reframed as opportunity and how no one dared to say, "We're failing." But failure doesn't wait for consensus. It accumulates and then it reveals. And while they crafted more narratives, the story they couldn't rewrite was unfolding in real time. A company running out of time and a leadership team that had confused noise for direction. I didn't celebrate. I didn't say, "I told you so," because I hadn't. I had simply waited. And now the system that claimed I was too quiet for leadership was losing everything I had once held together, quietly. It wasn't one decision that broke the company. It was all the ones they refused to revisit. The contracts they rushed, the warnings they ignored, the talent they overlooked, and all of it culminated in a quarter so weak it couldn't be hidden behind projections or spin. Revenue dropped sharply, not from lack of effort, but from misalignment. The clients who left weren't the high-maintenance ones. They were the dependable ones, the consistent ones, the ones who needed stability more than spectacle. And we had stopped offering it the moment we decided that presence mattered more than substance. The internal numbers leaked before leadership was ready. A junior analyst mistook an early draft of the quarterly forecast for the approved version and shared it with department heads. It spread fast. When the actual all-hands meeting was held, no one was surprised, just silent. Noah paced in front of the screen, rattling off words like headwinds, market recalibration, and temporary lag. But the numbers were there, on the screen, in the air, in the tension. No one looked at anyone else, because everyone knew the truth: we were sinking. And the leadership team didn't have a plan. Not a real one, not one grounded in operations or structure or recovery, just noise. More decks, more directionless strategy pivots, more attempts to excite a workforce that was exhausted from trying to do more with less clarity. Departments were restructured, which meant people were let go. Entire teams disbanded and redistributed under different titles. But no one explained the new responsibilities. No one clarified ownership. Projects began to stall, not from lack of motivation, but from fear. Everyone was trying to protect themselves, not the mission. And the mission, whatever it was now, had stopped being about excellence long ago. Noah stopped making eye contact with me in meetings. Maybe he thought I blamed him, but I didn't. Blame implies surprise, and I had seen this coming. I had watched the systems bend, then crack, then fray, and now they were falling apart in full view. I still did my job. Every task, every check, every update. I wasn't petty, I wasn't withdrawn, I was precise. Because I knew this phase was temporary, and when it ended, something else would begin. I just didn't know yet how directly I'd be part of it. The collapse was quiet at first, not because there was no damage, but because the leadership team tried to contain it behind closed doors. But you can't silence failure when the people living through it feel it in every meeting, every delay, every unexplained resignation. The client exits, once trickling, began to accelerate. One cited a need for clearer communication. Another chose internal alignment as their reason for leaving, language that looked polite on paper but felt like a reckoning in context. The agency's reputation, once steady if understated, began to shift. Former clients stopped replying to partnership inquiries. Cold leads stayed cold. Vendors grew stricter with payment terms. No one wanted to say it, but the signals were clear. We weren't trusted anymore. Noah held on. He gave one final presentation to the board, a last push filled with optimism, rebrands, and theoretical expansions. But behind the slides was a reality no deck could obscure. Cash flow had stalled, retention was low, and investor confidence had thinned to a thread. I wasn't in the room when they asked him to step down. I didn't need to be. I heard about it within the hour, in the way people spoke. Careful, speculative, quiet. By the next morning, his profile had been removed from the leadership page. No announcement, no thank you post, just absence, the kind that carries weight. In the days that followed, there was uncertainty. Meetings paused, projects were frozen mid-cycle. An interim board-appointed restructuring team was brought in. No one knew what came next, but beneath the surface of confusion, I felt something else stirring. Possibility. The board, looking for a path forward, began reaching out to people they had once overlooked. One of those calls came to me. A former investor, someone I had met during an operational audit years ago, asked for a conversation. "We've been reviewing stability data," she said. "Your name keeps coming up." She wasn't offering praise. She was offering trust, a chance to rebuild, not as a temporary fix, but as a new foundation. I didn't say yes immediately. I wanted to know what authority came with the role, what values would shape the next version of the company. And most of all, I wanted to know if they were ready to listen. This time, they were. Not because I spoke louder, but because the silence that had once dismissed me had finally spoken for itself, loudly, in outcomes, in losses, in lessons. And what it said was clear: quiet doesn't mean invisible. It means you were looking in the wrong direction. I didn't return to reclaim what had been taken from me. I returned to build what should have existed all along. When the board offered me the role of interim chief operations officer, it wasn't a gesture of apology. It was an acknowledgement of fact. They had reviewed the records, traced back the breakdowns, followed the patterns, and at every turning point, every missed opportunity, every ignored safeguard, my name was there not as the cause, but as the absent anchor. I accepted the role, but with clarity. I wasn't coming back to restore the old systems. I was coming to design a new one. Not based on visibility, but on durability. On quiet leadership that listens first, decides second, and speaks last. And I didn't do it alone. I met privately with the remaining teams, one by one, not to interrogate, but to understand. To hear what they had seen, what they had endured, what they had done to keep things moving while everything above them spiraled. Many of them had been like me, overlooked, underutilized, written off as too cautious, too methodical, too quiet. But now, their steadiness was exactly what we needed. Together, we didn't rush to launch. We didn't declare a cultural reinvention overnight. We started with audits, systems, workflows, vendor relationships, client communication chains. We asked hard questions, but not with shame, with precision. And slowly, the noise faded. The urgency was still there, but now it had direction. My leadership didn't look like the old regime. I didn't inspire with volume or rally with charisma. I led by making things clear, by restoring process where there had been panic, by giving people the confidence that every decision was grounded in something more durable than bravado. I stopped calling it a comeback. It wasn't. I hadn't returned to what I left. I had returned to make sure no one else would be pushed out for leading the way I had. Quietly, and with integrity. Leadership didn't change me. It revealed what had always been true, that I never needed to become louder to be respected. I needed to be in a space where listening was valued as much as speaking. In the year that followed, we didn't just recover, we redefined. The company shifted from chasing noise to building resonance. We rebuilt client relationships one by one, not with promises, but with proof. We stopped launching campaigns to impress and started delivering results that lasted. The team changed too, not just in personnel, but in posture. People began to ask questions again, not because they were uncertain, but because curiosity was no longer punished. Feedback wasn't filtered to please executives. It was used, applied, integrated. Slowly, the culture recalibrated. New managers were hired not for their charisma, but for their clarity. Employees who once sat silent in meetings now spoke with assurance, not because they changed, but because the room finally made space for them. I stepped fully into the CEO role 1 year later. There was no press release, no corporate spotlight, just a quiet handoff from the restructuring board and a simple mandate: don't lose what you've restored. I didn't. I built systems around what had once been invisible. Institutional memory, ethical resilience, thoughtful urgency, and I kept the company's name, not to preserve the past, but to redeem it. Today, when people ask how I turned it around, I give them no formula. Just this truth: I didn't turn it around. I waited for it to see itself clearly, then I built what they couldn't. And now, every new hire learns the same leadership model I once embodied in silence. We call it quiet systems thinking, a structure where consistency matters more than theatrics, where the softest voice at the table might be the one worth listening to. I don't speak more often now. I still choose my words, but when I speak, the room listens. Not because I changed my tone, but because I never stopped being right. They simply stopped pretending otherwise.